Well, today's a little bit of show and tell. When you see this image here, what comes to mind? The Buddha, of course, but what about this particular gesture, this touching of the earth? Some people call it a mudra. Mudra is actually the wrong term for it because it's anachronistic. This actually comes before Tantric Buddhism, in which mudras became important. I'll just be calling it a gesture. So in any event, what comes to mind? Some of us may be familiar with a story about this gesture being involved with the Buddha overcoming Mara, defeating Mara and becoming enlightened. But in fact, when you look for that story in the early texts, in the Pali texts and in their other recensions and other languages, you don't find that story. So where does this come from? When I first realized this, I assumed that there would be a relatively straightforward and easy answer, that I would just go looking in recent scholarship and find a paper that described where it came from. I looked around and wasn't able to find anything. I contacted my many scholarly friends, and they couldn't find anything either. So I decided to investigate it myself, and what came out of that investigation was a paper. I decided to write my own paper. And it's just been published recently in the Indian International Journal of Buddhist Studies. So what I want to do in today's video is to go over at least a few of the results that I found. And of course, I also want to thank a lot of friends and colleagues for their help in basically producing the paper, because I couldn't have done it myself. Now, when we look for the origins of this gesture, there are two main sources of evidence that we can have. One is the literary evidence, evidence from texts and so on, and the other is the sculptural evidence. Now, my paper was about the literary evidence in particular. I don't have enough of a background in the sculpture to be able to know that for sure, although I know a little bit about it. As I say, when we look at the early text, the early literary evidence, we don't find this particular gesture mentioned at all. Indeed, when we look at Ashvagosa's Buddha Charita, which is a very important text, probably the earliest or one of the earliest attempts to make a complete biography of the Buddha from the early 2nd century of the Common Era, we don't find any mention of this gesture either. And I think that's important to show that there probably wasn't any kind of long-standing literary example of this gesture, otherwise Ashvagosa would have included it. And in fact, we know that about that same time, the 2nd century of the Common Era, examples of this gesture were beginning to be made in Gandhara. So what we find is a bit of a conundrum. We find sculptural representations, but we don't find literary examples, or at least we don't find literary examples in one of the most important biographies of the Buddha at the same time. However, by investigating, by looking around, by asking friends and colleagues, I was able to turn up 8 other literary references that began around the same time, began around the 2nd century of the Common Era, and then extended into the later centuries. Now the question is why this literary evidence arose. What was the point of it? What was the point of the gesture and the literary evidence? In the first place, it had a didactic purpose. It was intended to teach something about the Buddha's life, in particular about the Buddha, probably about the Buddha's enlightenment. Secondly, clearly the gesture has something to do with the earth. And thirdly, the gesture plays a role in a particular narrative that we'll discuss in a moment. So to begin with, as I say, first, the gesture clearly has didactic importance. It's supposed to teach a particular lesson. In particular, I think it's supposed to teach something about the Buddha's life to people who might not be familiar with the Buddha. To teach about, in particular, the most important part of the Buddha's life, the Buddha's attainment of enlightenment. That momentary breakthrough that can be, I think, analogized to a kind of a touching, a kind of a touch that one might make with the way things are. Second, as I say, this gesture is a touching, but not a touching of just anything, it's a touching of the earth. And why the earth? Well, if we look at the early texts the earth stands in for a kind of a perfect equanimity in certain texts. In particular, we can think of the text that involves the Buddha's giving a discourse to his son Rahula. And in that discourse, the Buddha recommends that Rahula undertake a meditation that is like the earth. And the Buddha describes it this way: "For when you develop meditation that is like the earth, arisen agreeable and disagreeable contacts will not invade your mind and remain. Just as people throw clean things and dirty things, excrement, urine, spittle, pus, and blood on the earth, and the earth is not repelled, humiliated, and disgusted because of that, so too, Rahula, develop meditation that is like the earth." So in this image, the Buddha is making contact with a kind of equanimity that overcomes agreeable and disagreeable contacts, and we can, I think, analogize or understand practice as attempting to lead us towards just such a result. Now, third, we can look to the literary evidence for a discussion of this particular gesture and what role it plays in a small narrative. Now, this narrative has a structure, at least in its iconic form, in its most famous form that comes down to us, and this structure is, roughly speaking, in 5 parts. First, Mara challenges the Bodhisattva. That is to say, Mara, who is the tempter, this kind of creature of malice in Buddhism, challenges the Bodhisattva on the eve of his enlightenment. And the Bodhisattva takes an oath and calls the earth to witness his karmic potency. In other words, he's been challenged by Mara that his karma is not adequate to the job of becoming enlightened. The Bodhisattva takes this oath, calling the earth to witness that he has this karma. And then, third, the Bodhisattva touches the earth. Fourth, the earth witnesses the Bodhisattva's karma through causing an earthquake. An earthquake arises that is the witness there, and that earthquake then defeats Mara. These are the 5 aspects of this short narrative. Now, the Buddhist scholar Maria Spagnoli uses this narrative to come to one possible hypothesis as to the origin of this gesture. She notes that this narrative involves oath-taking combined with touching the earth. And she notes that one doesn't typically find that kind of association of making an oath with touching the earth in ancient India. However, she notes that one does find just such an example in at least a couple of literary examples from ancient Greece, of oaths that were taken in association with touching the earth. So Maria Spagnoli's hypothesis is that this particular gesture might have arisen in, let's say, Gandhara, which was a hotbed of mixing ideas ideas from Greece and Buddhism, and that particular idea of an oath might therefore have arisen in this particular sculptural representation. It's important to keep in mind that this idea of ancient Greece, or what's known as Hellenism, came to the area of Gandhara with the advances of Alexander the Great, roughly speaking a century or so after the Buddha's lifetime. Now, when I began to write my paper, I was not actually familiar with Maria Spagnoli's hypothesis, and only discovered it during the writing. In fact, during the rewriting, when the editor of the journal turned this paper up and gave it to me so that I could respond to it in the paper. And I think it is a very interesting hypothesis that Spagnoli makes. It's impossible to say for sure. It certainly is possible that some Hellenistic influence is involved in this particular gesture. However, there are some problems, some issues with it. In particular, when we look at the literary evidence, which is really the only evidence we have for the story behind the gesture, we find, in fact, that there's not really any single literary story. There are many stories, and they're all slightly different, or most of them are, at least in many respects. In some of the examples, there isn't an oath at all. In other examples, the oath isn't obviously associated with the gesture. And in still other examples, the gesture is different. It doesn't really involve a touching of the earth. So, and I give these examples in my paper. I'm not going to go through them all here because it would be kind of tedious, but in any event, that's the general point. And my sense is that, therefore, if we're going to look for any kind of a real answer to where this gesture and how this gesture arose, that looking for any kind of single causal influence, such as a causal influence out of Hellenism, out of ancient Greece, is probably going to be too simplistic. That it arose through probably a nexus of causes and conditions, many of which would have been indigenous to the Indian culture itself. What I think we can say is that this gesture most likely arose, as I say, didactically. That is to say, in order to teach something about the Buddha and his life, in order to teach about the moment of his enlightenment in particular. That the gesture arose as a way to depict that momentary breakthrough to enlightenment, to seeing things as they really are, to making contact with this kind of perfect equanimity represented by the earth. And then, having arisen in a didactic context to teach something, the literary tales arose around the gesture. Because the literary evidence that we have, at least in the main, is evidence from after when the gesture seems to have first taken hold in Gandhara. So another example or another point that we have to make is that this gesture seems to have arisen just in the time period after the ideas of aniconism had begun to wane. Aniconism is this idea, this concept, this movement in early Buddhist sculpture where the idea of representing the Buddha in human form was thought of as something not to do, that one should instead represent the Buddha as an absence than a presence. This form seems to have arisen just in the period when that was ending. And that particular point may be critical to, in fact, the arising of this very narrative. Now, I'm going to get to that point in the next video, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen when it's ready. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine and would like to help support the channel, take a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to lend a hand. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.